Buenas tardes, bienvenidos al Instituto Cervantes, al Centro Cultural Español. My name is Javier Valdivieso and I am the director of this cultural center. We are delighted to welcome you and host this panel, which springs in part from the exhibition Guardians of the Glaciers, which you can visit in our gallery until April 1st. It features the work of Peruvian photographer Ángela Ponce, documenting the accelerated melting of the Quelccaya in Peru and the profound effects that melting is having on the region. As another activity related to this exhibition, we would like to inform you that on March 18, World Poetry and Glacier Day, we will be organizing a performance evening with poetry in Spanish and Quechua, ending with music composed specifically for the occasion. Returning to today's meeting, we also present this panel in alignment with UNESCO International Day of Women and Girls in Science. According to UNESCO, women continue to represent less than 1/3 of the world's researchers. Today, on the International Day of Women and Girls in Science, we would like to pay tribute to the Spanish scientist Josefina Castelví, who passed away just a few days ago. A pioneering marine microbiologist and oceanographer, she was among the first Spanish women to set foot in Antarctica and later became the first woman in the world to lead a scientific base there, directing the Spanish Antarctic base Juan Carlos I from 1988 to 1993. I cannot conclude without thanking the moderator and panelists for their generous participation. The United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, for its collaboration, and especially the Consulate General of Peru, our partners in all this program. I give the floor to Jane Balbin, moderator of this meeting, writer, reporter, and producer focused on science, climate change, and politics. Her reporting has taken her to the Greenland ice sheet for a series of stories about the impact of melting glaciers on sea level rise in US coastal cities. Her work has appeared in various and prestigious media. Please, Jane, I wait you here.
Thank you so much, Javier. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today to celebrate this Day of Women and Girls in Science and STEM. I just want to briefly remind everyone that we will be taking questions from the audience for our panel as the evening goes on. So please make a mental note if you have some questions for our panelists as they do their presentations. Thank you. Allow me now to introduce our first panelist. Almudena Fernandez is Chief Economist for Latin America and the Caribbean at the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP. She is the main author of the latest UNDP Regional Human Development Report, Under Pressure, Recalibrating the Future of Development in Latin America and the Caribbean. She specializes in the analysis of economic and policy trends, focusing on important things like inequality, poverty, and sustainable development in Latin America and the Caribbean, and she has over 2 decades of experience. Ms. Fernandez holds a master's degree in public administration from Columbia University and a bachelor's degree in economics and anthropology from the University of Chicago. May I welcome you to the podium.
Thank you so much, Jane, and hello to everyone. Good evening. It's really a pleasure to be here representing UNDP in this important day for International Day for Women and Girls in Science. Allow me to start thanking and greeting our other participants, Javier Valdivieso from the Cervantes Institute, Dr. Alison Kane, and Dr. Robin Bell. It's really a pleasure to be able to share with you this presentation. So what I'll do is I'll share with you, based on our recent Regional Human Development Report, a little bit of the interconnections we're finding between human development and a rapidly changing climate and how that's impacting the life of people in Latin America and the Caribbean. So a report that's called Under Pressure, and we're looking at development trends in Latin America, and why are we saying development in Latin America is under pressure? So what we see is Latin America and the Caribbean is a region that has been growing, grew significantly for a number of decades and made very significant progress in terms of advancing human development in the past few decades. However, what we see, and this is important to note, is that it was a region that was most affected in terms of their human development impact during the COVID pandemic. So we had reversals that were more significant than anywhere else in the world. Also, it took the region a couple of years to recover its pre-pandemic levels. So it took the region a few years to go able to go back to those levels that we were observing in terms of human development from before the pandemic. And also, its development path was altered permanently after the pandemic. But most importantly, perhaps, is the pandemic is just one shock that affected the region. What we see in the region is that progress towards human development started to slow down even before that. It started to slow down about a decade ago. So the region has done great things in terms of reducing poverty, advancing social indicators, but that progress is starting to slow down. Also important to note in terms of the development trajectory of a region like Latin America and the Caribbean is that while the region has made a lot of progress in terms of reducing poverty. So poverty was reduced from about 50% in 2000 to about 25% in the last data that we have, 2023, 2024. So we were able to reduce poverty by half. This is very important progress. However, we do see that this progress slows down also about a decade ago. We do see the impact of the pandemic being very significant, with some countries still not being able to recover their poverty levels from before the pandemic. Other countries have done better, and that's why we see an average where we're still declining. But also very significantly is the way that the region has moved towards human development is that while we've been able to reduce poverty, there is a group of people that remain in a very vulnerable condition. They're no longer poor, but they haven't been able to progress towards being a stable middle class. So we have about 30% of the population on average in Latin America and the Caribbean, which, while they're no longer poor, they are vulnerable to falling into poverty in the event of any adverse event that happens, be it to the household or that happens at a more systemic level. So if we have to summarize development in Latin America and the Caribbean in a nutshell, what we can say is that the region made very significant progress in the last few decades. However, that progress was unequal. It was unequal between countries and within countries. That progress slowed down about a decade ago, started to slow down about a decade ago, and is very vulnerable to reversals. We're very vulnerable to reversing that progress in the event of any adverse shock. So that's why in the report we talk about a new era of uncertainty. An era where what we're seeing in the region is a combination of known and more traditional risks. So the region has always been had to manage a series of risks that come from extreme weather events, risks that come from its geographical position, risks that come from its macroeconomic volatility. However, these risks, whenever they manifest as shocks, are manifesting more intensely and more frequently. So across the board, we're seeing a region that is more constantly under crisis. These risks are also combining with a series of new threats that are emerging from deep changes in our societies. For the purpose of this analysis, we divided those threats around three broad areas. One having to do with rapidly evolving technologies. While new technologies, artificial intelligence, et cetera, represent a number of opportunities for the region, there are also a number of risks that need to be taken into account. A second risk emerging from the deepening fragmentation within our societies. Latin America is becoming more and more polarized and becoming more and more fragmented. And finally, and this is the area where we go a little bit deeper today because of the purpose of this exhibition, is risks that are emerging from a rapidly changing climate. And while climate change is not new, what we're seeing is that more and more this is impacting the life of people in the region and their capacity to advance towards human development. So I think one thing that is very clear is that climate change is now a reality in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's not something we need to plan for in the future. It is now a reality. And it's threatening human development in a region that is highly exposed to climate risk and with limited adaptive capacity. So what we see is that LAC is one of the most exposed regions, and also it has very low readiness to respond to any shocks that come. So what we see, for example, is for its level of human development compared to the rest of the world, Latin America tends to be the region that is less prepared to deal with these emerging risks coming from a rapidly changing climate. Climate change pressures are deeply interconnected, and they affect the life of people in a number of ways. So some of these ways, and this is by no means a comprehensive list, have to do with temperatures, rises in sea level, water insecurity, natural hazards and their frequency and intensity, food insecurity, as well as compound events. What we're seeing more and more in the region is a number of events that compound some of these things. For example, the number of wildfires in the region has increased exponentially. That is a compound impact of higher temperatures, more drought, and different things that come together. And if we think of glaciers, the one thing that brings us all together to this presentation today, you can see how all of these impacts interact and have an impact on glaciers as well. And we're going to hear more about glaciers from our fellow panelists, but it's very clear to see how temperatures, changes in sea level, water insecurity, these are all related, either impacting glaciers or the decreasing glaciers impacting these. And just to give you some data, we see that Andean glaciers are retreating at unprecedented rates in the region, and if we compare this to previous generations, and we see how this directly affects water supply, agriculture, hydropower stability, and service cost across the board. So a few numbers just to give you some idea of where we're talking about. In Colombia, for example, approximately 90% of glacier cover has disappeared over the past century. We see countries like Venezuela where 100% of glaciers have vanished, meaning the country has completely lost its glacier coverage. Ecuador, we see the Antisana Glacier has retreated around 30% in the last 50 years. And in Peru, which is what we're going to see in the exhibition today, we see that while it holds more than 70% of the world's top tropical glaciers, and has nearly lost half of its glacier surface in the last 50 years. So we see that this is a very important and very significant evident problem in the region. Just to show you some other data around this. So we're seeing, for example, the rise in temperatures already a reality in the region. We're seeing in the past few years that the degrees of temperature in the region has increased significantly. It's very obvious to see, and this has an impact in people's lives. This has an impact, for example, in the number of days that people are exposed to dangerous heat. This shows the number of additional days that people are exposed to extreme heat in the region by country compared to an average from 1991 to 2020, and this is data for 2024. So if you can see, for example, a country like Barbados people are exposed to 160 more days of dangerous heat than they were just a decade ago. We also see that this has an impact in food security. So Latin America and the Caribbean is a region that produces a lot of food, but it also has a lot of food insecurity issues. And we're seeing that this increased heat, this compounded pressure from climate change are impacting the way people have access to food. And then we also see, if we look at it from a more economic perspective, we see that there are significant productivity loss that is associated with higher temperatures, lower water, and all these compounded climate pressures. For example, we expect that by 2030, productivity is expected to decline by 4.5 percentage points when we compare to an average from 1986 to 2006. So that decrease in productivity is very significant, and this is in a region that has traditionally had low productivity, and one of its greatest challenges is how to increase this productivity. Just from a human development perspective, human development as we understand it in UNDP, as we work on it, is based on freedom. Freedom for people to do and live and have the life they wish to live. So human development is about much more than income poverty or education or health. It's a combination of all these things that allow people to live the lives they want to live. When we look at what's happening around climate and all these new risks that are emerging, this new era of uncertainty that I talked about previously, what we're seeing is also people having a deterioration in their capacity to think about the future. People feel more at risk. People feel less able to plan for a future, to invest in a future, to see the possibility of their children having a better future. And this has an impact in their agency being a significant part of human development, agency being their capacity to impact the decisions that have an impact in their life. So what we're seeing is that this uncertainty, these changes in climate, if not addressed, and other risks that are emerging, have a very, very direct impact on the people's ability to plan and see and act towards the lives they want to live. Interestingly enough, and I will close very soon, but what we see, we did this survey in Latin America and the Caribbean in a number of countries, and asking people how worried are they about climate change? Are they more worried today than they were last year, just to have a measure of comparison? And what we see is that people around the world are worried, but people in Latin America and the Caribbean are particularly worried about the future. This is an issue that concerns them. This is an issue that impacts their daily life, the lives they live every day. When we ask people, sorry, I can't see very well. Does climate change impact their big life decisions? Does this have an impact on what I decide, whether I have kids, whether I have an education? Much more people in this region than in the rest of the world responded that yes, these are things that are having an impact in how they decide to live their lives, which is very significant. And finally, when we look at whether they think their governments should be doing more about it, whether they think their institutions should be taking bigger steps in terms of climate action, we also see a very on average, more people in the region tend to respond, yes, my government should be doing more around this. So this is something that is part of the perceptions of people, and it's interesting. Interestingly enough, and of course, these are all perception surveys, so people are asked what they think. When people are asked whether economic growth should be a priority or the environment should be a priority, what we see is, interestingly enough, that while yes, more people tend to say economic growth should be a priority, there's a significant portion of the population that thinks the environment should be a priority. And an important, around 20% of the population that says that neither. So I think one of the challenges in a region like Latin America is how do we start creating a pathway for economic growth within sustainable boundaries and within protecting the environment that we can look forward to. So, clear message, climate change is a reality in the region. People are seeing it in their day-to-day lives. People are seeing it impact their day-to-day lives. It's threatening human development progress. It's threatening the capacity to human development to continue to advance, but it's also threatening that progress that has already been made with reversals. And it's a region that is highly exposed to climate risks with limited capacity. So what our analysis proposes, and the work that UNDP is doing in the region right now, is really focused on how do we put resilience at the center of this conversation, resilience at the center of the development conversation. And resilience is a concept that has been used around issues around climate change for a long time, but sometimes the agendas around climate change, mitigation, adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and those agendas around social development don't necessarily converge at the country level. So how do we look at resilience as an integrating principle, understanding that everything that has to do with climate change and everything that has to do with social policy have to come together for progress to be able to be achieved. And what we propose, and I think that what we try to convey in the report, is that there's a lot of opportunities here. People want change, people want action. People are willing to bring to the conversation, to the political conversation, the need to look at progress in a different way. So we bring the concept of a new development playbook that is fit for our times. A lot of the policies designed in countries in Latin America and the Caribbean around climate change adaptation and around social policy were designed decades ago, and the times have changed. So how do we think about a new development playbook that combines instruments, institutions, infrastructure, but that have the capacity not only to respond to shocks, but also to anticipate what's coming, to anticipate changes around climate, changes around other transformations of society, that can respond to these when these occur, and that also have the capacity to rebound and flourish even in the presence of more uncertainty, more crisis. So our call to action is that if we continue to move towards human development, that requires us to adapt our strategies to how we achieve it. While human development continues to be our vision, how we get there needs to change and adapt with our times. LAC has been for many decades at the forefront of this adaptation. LAC is a region that is highly innovative when it comes to social policy, when it comes to environmental policy. So we think bringing resilience at the center of this development, we can safeguard hard-won gains. We can push forward so human development continues to advance, and we can ensure that societies can withstand shocks while also being able to thrive and flourish in times of uncertainty. So that's a little bit of the call to action, is bringing this, we need to think about human development and all issues around climate change together. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Almudena. Such an informative report. I have so many questions, but we have more panelists to hear from. So up next, we have Dr. Allison Kane. She's a cultural anthropologist at the University of Wyoming. Her research explores health and well-being in rural contexts. Her first book came out recently entitled Restless Ecologies, Climate Change and Socio-Ecological Futures in the Peruvian Highlands. It's a fascinating account of her time doing research in the Peruvian Andes among a community of herders. And I was telling her earlier, it's a fabulous story. I got the book and I highly recommend it. She talks about their livelihoods, raising alpaca, llamas, and some sheep, and the contracting glacier and water that they depend upon. And she'll tell us more about it now. Please welcome Dr. Allison Kane.
Thank you so much, Janet, for the introduction. And thank you to Instituto Cervantes for holding this event and for inviting me to take part. I'm really honored to be here. There we go. So I'm especially honored to be taking part in this event, to have the opportunity to speak alongside the exhibit by Peruvian photographer Ángela Ponce, whose beautiful photographs were taken just a short distance from where I conducted research in the Cordillera of Vilcanota of southeastern Peru. So here's a satellite image of that mountain chain. You can see, oh, I have a little pointer. Here we go. You can see that right down here is the Quelccaya ice cap on the eastern terminus. And about 80 kilometers to the west is the community of Chilca, where I was based. So right about here on the southern slopes of Ausangate Mountain. It's a community of about 350 people living at 14,000 feet. So at the feet of these glaciers that are retreating quite rapidly and upon which they depend for the majority of their livelihoods. And I'm especially glad to be here today to speak somewhat in part on behalf of the women and girls of Chilca, who are the true knowledge keepers of this region, incredible scientists, incredibly knowledgeable about their landscape and their world and what's happening there. As an environmental anthropologist, I'm very interested in understanding people's knowledge about the environment, about the world, and how it's changing, and how they pick up a lot of that information through their work with other species that they live with. So that brought me eventually to work in the community of Chilca, where, as it turns out, women are the primary pastoralists in this community. They have incredibly rich, detailed, specialized knowledge about animals, about grasses, about waterways, and knowledge which is sadly underrepresented in most of the literature coming out of this region, but also many of the development efforts that are happening to prepare these communities for futures with increased glacier retreat. So I just have a short presentation today just to give a little bit of background, and then I really look forward to your questions. But I was fortunate enough to have been taken in at one point as an apprentice to the work of alpaca herding in the community of Chilca. So for over a year, I did an immersive ethnographic research project in the community in the Quechua language, which was really critical, not only for my ability to communicate with people there, but also to come to know the landscape and understand the landscape. A lot of that happens through the sort of grammatical structure of the language itself and how it calls into participation other beings, both human and non-human. And I was eventually taken under the wing of one particular herder, Concepcion Rojo Rojo, who's here on the right, a tremendous matriarch in the community, a very skilled alpaca herder, a singer of Andean Huayno folk music, so also an incredible poet, and a very generous and patient teacher. She took me in and taught me how to herd alpacas, how to come to know that landscape, what's happening to it, and eventually introduced me to the rest of the women of the community who also very generously shared that knowledge with me. And what was evident during my time in Chilca is obviously the immense pressure that these communities are experiencing due to climatic changes, especially periods of drought, as well as the impacts of glacier retreat. Their livelihoods are almost entirely sustained by these glaciers, especially the water that the glaciers provide for the alpine wetlands, so the bofedales, that are these incredibly vibrant socio-ecological spaces that provide pasture for their animals, and the animals then in turn provide wool and meat and income for the community. And what we're seeing is that it's becoming more challenging in communities like Chilca to sustain their herds on these wetlands and sustain their broader communities. And a lot of that has to do with the disruption of glacial water, which leads to the fragmentation of these wetlands and often kind of ripples out into conflict and further fragmentation among humans and animals in landscapes here. So one thing I want to highlight, sort of, since we're talking about women and girls in science today, is that the scientific method looks quite different up there in Chilca, which can make it challenging for the women and girls there to have their knowledge and their expertise and their skill be taken seriously. So for example, many of the methods that they have for gathering and evaluating data about the environment involve really elaborate, really elaborate communicative systems with their animals. So how they whistle to their animals, how their animals respond to their whistles, and how they're able to pick up really detailed, nuanced information about what's happening in the grasslands, what's happening to water resources through observing their animals' behavior, and especially how their animals respond to communication. So they know that the climate is changing often through the way that their animals signal those changes to them. And it's these shifts in sort of social engagement between humans and animals that are really reflective of these broader changes that they're seeing in this entire social and ecological collective that is their community. One of the biggest impacts that came out of this period of time that I was there was that this was a community that used to pasture all of their animals together on a commons. That became much more difficult to sustain once they had the fragmentation of wetlands. It created a lot more conflict between neighbors. The animals were crossing boundaries. that they shouldn't have been crossing, and eventually it caused the community to vote to privatize their lands. And so we saw, yet again, the enclosure of the commons and a sort of change in their communal resource management system because of intense environmental stress. It's also important to note that in recent years, many of the women and girls in Chilca have been working in partnership with organizations in the area, especially ESEMA, which is directed by a colleague of mine, Dina Farfan, to develop fluency in new languages, right? So to develop fluency in sort of conventional scientific methods and presentation in order to speak across difference, to build and expand upon their existing regional knowledge systems, and to advocate for the needs of their community. So again, I'm very honored to be here today to speak to some of my work and to some of their work, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison. I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's questions as well and the answers. Our next panelist is Dr. Robin Bell. She is a research professor at Columbia University at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. She directs research programs in Antarctica and Greenland. Dr. Bell has coordinated 10 major expeditions to Antarctica and Greenland. And when we were talking earlier, she was telling me that the elevations in Antarctica are quite high. So not only is she dealing with extreme climate, but she's also dealing with elevation. Dr. Bell has coordinated the exhibits, and she also, I wanted to mention, studies Antarctica and Greenland to find out what makes ice sheets collapse, so extremely relevant to what we're talking about tonight. She received her undergraduate degree in geology from Middlebury College in Vermont and her PhD in geophysics from Columbia University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bell.
Well, what an amazing pair of acts to follow. It's really my honor to be here, and I'm going to take you on a slightly different journey. I'm going to look a little bit more globally and sort of see where we get. I've had the honor of a career where I started out as a little kid who'd walk in the backyard and flip over the rocks to see what was underneath. Wasn't very good for the paving stones, but it was just, I was always curious about what was underneath. And then when I got to high school, I learned you could use physics to explain the planet. And that was just marvelous, the fact that you could use physics. It's in some way very similar to the women we just heard listening to their animals and the frequencies in their animals to understand the environment. I learned I could use physics to understand the environment around me. And then I discovered I could use it to actually understand the planet. And decided to go to graduate school. And you probably don't know that there's a research institute right on the cliffs overlooking the Hudson, about 11 miles north of here. This is the Hudson on the left in the blue, and that's the Research Institute. And this is where some of the fundamental observations of the Earth and physics have been made. Observations that I like to think, when we look at our phone tells us where to go and where we want to be, how we might know what the weather is, maybe what we want to eat. All of that comes on a device that depends very much on our fundamental understanding of how our planet works. When I got there, about 40 years ago, maybe a little longer, the love of my life had gone to law school at Columbia, so I decided I should apply here. It was not a very welcoming place. My story here today is that institutions can change over time. and that we have to figure out how that happens. And when I got there, the only senior woman was this woman called Marie Tharp. She changed fundamentally the way we thought about our planet. Here she is making a map from data that she wasn't allowed to collect. She's sitting in this estate house of Lamont, who gave the land to Columbia. But what she did was she made a map. She also liked to look underneath things. She liked to look underneath the ocean. She made a map of what was underneath the ocean. She discovered this mountain range, the mid-ocean ridge, the largest mountain range on our planet, and the one that fundamentally explained that Europe is moving away from North America about as fast as your fingernails are growing. But when I got there, she was not respected. She was not honored. She didn't have a professorship. When I arrived, it was a toxic environment. Women were not welcome. But I've seen that institution change from an institution where I wouldn't speak up in class, where Marie wasn't honored, to a place where now women lead, women run programs, and we honor Marie. I was able to bring her to, we had a Marie Tharp Day at Lamont, and I was able to bring my daughter to meet her, which was like a highlight for me. It still gives me goosebumps, right? But Marie made her discoveries from her desk, but things have changed. This is what the top of an ice sheet looks like. When you go down to the exhibition, you'll see what the edge of an ice sheet looks like. But a lot of the ice sheet looks like this. It's kind of flat. It is really flat. It goes on forever. There's actually a runway in the middle of this. It's so flat. And the sky is this spectacular blue because you're so high up in the atmosphere. But this is where I get back to the little kid who wanted to look underneath. Underneath that flat surface are mountains and lakes and rivers that run uphill. And that's where we've come in 40 years from where we told graduate students of the female persuasion they were not allowed to go in the field, to where women can lead, women can make discoveries. This is me standing on that runway, and this is the airplanes we used, and this is an area the size of California and the mountain range, which is taller than the Pyrenees, but is hidden by that flat ice sheet. And of course it gets better because I'm a geek, right? There's water in all those valleys, and the water flows in the rivers flows backwards. I mean, isn't our planet's just amazing? And they told me when I was going here I was wasting the government money. Anyway, I think they were wrong. But one of the things that neither Marie nor I appreciated 40 years ago, that the planet could change. When I wrote my first paper about ice in Antarctica, we had to take out the lines in 1990 about the possibility of the ice changing fast. But now we know, we heard today, it's in Peru, but I'm going to show you in Antarctica how it's changing fast, because I always like to show people the evidence. This is where in the 1990s it was flowing about 2 kilometers a year, but by the 2000s it had doubled in speed to 4 kilometers a year. The ice is flowing faster. Ice is kind of like a good soft cheese on top of your pizza, and when you bite it, it stretches. So what's also happening is everywhere it's yellow, the ice sheet's getting lower. So in that same time that we saw, I'm going to show you it again while I talk, because why not? Because you're more likely to remember. Let's see. In the same time we saw the ice sheet speeding up, we saw it dropping up to 60 meters. So as I like to say when people ask me, what is the evidence for changing? It's like we have one line of evidence the ice is going faster, and another line of evidence that it's getting lower. and kind of that in Western science, that high fidelity, two independent measurements of the same phenomena. So getting faster, getting lower, and then it turns out you can actually also measure the weight of the glacier over this same time period. And so we were looking at this space right here. And what you're going to see is that area turn red over time. And what's happening is that ice sheet is losing mass. So again, a third measurement, something that in Western standards is a very powerful, 3 observations pointing to the same conclusion. And you can see this is called the Pine Island and the Situates region that's being highlighted right now in the New York Times. It's getting deeper and deeper red as you lose more and more mass. Yes, there are some places in Antarctica, guess what? It's snowing more and it's gaining mass there. That's why it's blue. But there's a lot more red than there is blue. It is certainly outweighing. And it's happening both in, take a quick visit to Greenland and Antarctica, just so you know. This one's a little slower. You're going to see the same pattern develop on the right in Antarctica. And now you know you're going to be looking for yellows and reds for loss. Am I making it run? No, we got to turn it on. I'm sorry. Let's see if we can turn it on. There we go. You can actually see slowly the yellowness develop on the left-hand side of Antarctica. And then you can see in Greenland, it's yellow all around the edges. Greenland's very different than Antarctica. Antarctica's very isolated. It sits on the South Pole with the currents spinning around, isolating it from the rest of the world, whereas Greenland is stuck right down in the middle of the North Atlantic. So it's very susceptible to change. And all the change we feel here, it feels in Greenland. So you can see both the ice sheets. There's very strong evidence for them changing. And I didn't put the image in, but I still like to have you, if you put your hand down on your leg, probably just below your knee, that there is an instrument down at the battery that's been measuring sea level for the last 100 years, basically since my grandmother was born, plus a little. And the sea level there has gone up that much. And that is only the warming. We're only starting to see the change from the mountain glaciers that we were hearing about today and Antarctica and Greenland. So for looking on how to build a resilient Latin America and Caribbean, we will have to consider sea level change. So it's really human hands that are causing that change. And as we heard from the UN is putting forward on how to have actions for a sustainable, and I love the concept of a resilient future now. But we also need to deepen our scientific expertise. We need to broaden what we consider. We need to bring in observers and scientists of the non-classic fabric, such as we heard from Allison. And we need to make sure the doors are open for women and girls, because the more people we have at the table doing science, engaged in science, the better knowledge we have for the future of our planet. And this is just some of my favorites of, a young woman on top of the ice sheet telling the airplane where to go. Young women in Montreal learning about physics. 2 Greenlandic women mapping the edge of their shoreline. This work would end up with new words in the Greenlandic language for sea level, mapping the Ross Ice Shelf. And then, of course, I'm a mom, right? So here's my daughter trying to tell me what particle physics is and how a particle accelerator is. Do not ask me. I don't understand. But it's pretty cool. So where are we? We are at a place where it's very clear that we know how to change institutions and that we know that science, engineering, innovation, and technology are stronger when we have everyone at the table. So really, I think it's time for all of us to think about how we pull those levers of change and how we open the doors. Sometimes we might have to wait for the right moment to open the door or turn the lever, but we all have to be looking for those doors and levers for the future of our planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bell. I'd like to invite our panelists now to please join, to be seated at the stage, and I will join you there. We'll ask a couple of questions, and then we'll get questions from the audience. Thank you. Go ahead. There we go. He even gave us a tutorial, like you won't hear the mic come on immediately, and yet I forgot. So there you go. I had prepared a number of specific questions to kick off our discussion. And again, thank you all so much, ladies, for such incredibly informative and lovely presentations. There are so many. I wish we had more time because I would ask a dozen questions of each of you about your specific fields of research. But I thought that we could sort of narrow it down, given our reason for being here tonight, to talk about, first off, why don't we start with you, Almudena? Since we haven't heard from you in a while, I was hoping that you could explain the role of climate change in exacerbating the upheaval and uncertainty impacting the people of the LAC region. And I know you did talk about this a bit during your presentation, but maybe you could expound a bit for the audience. Yeah, why don't you try that one? And again, it will go on slowly.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, and thank you for the question, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I think those were wonderful presentations, and I think we talked about very different things, but they all come together in terms of the future of the planet. And of course, I focus in Latin America and the Caribbean, but I think how are we thinking about the future, and how thinking about the future, it's not only about thinking about growth or development in a very specific way, but it's a kind of overarching idea of where we want to go and how we get there. But more specifically to your question, so, you know, as I was saying in my presentation, I think we want to think about human development very broadly, right? So again, it's not just about growth, it's not just about specific environment, it's about how people have the capacity to live the lives they want to live. And I think that is very fundamental of our understanding of development in the UN and UNDP, because it really brings together all of the different perspectives. And I think one thing that is very clear is that climate change and overall planetary imbalances are impacting the way people have a capacity to live the lives they live. They're creating uncertainty. They have impacts on migration. They have impacts on food security. They have impacts on their people's capacity to work. You know, a lot of Latin America and the Caribbean has a agricultural economy is very large. Being outside and working in these very high temperatures is much more difficult. Subsistence farming is much more difficult. So, you know, people are moving into the cities. So then we have all the issues around urbanization. So I think it's very much a piece of the puzzle of how we think about what is that future we want for the region and how we get there. And I think one thing that is fundamental is we tend, even I can say from the UN, but even at the level of our governments, at the national level, at the subnational level, even in academia, I think we tend to think about these issues in very siloed approaches. We all have expertise, it's very different, but I think what the world needs right now, and climate change is a very clear example of that, is all these fields of expertise coming together to really think about how we get to that future we want. I think working in silos is no longer gonna get us there, but maybe I'll stop there.
Okay, and are you having success with that interdisciplinary sort of approach?
I think we are. And I think it's it's step by step. But in just a decade ago, in 2015, the world, the 197 members of the United Nations agreed on a sustainable development agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, that bring together all these issues in one agenda that each one of these countries committed to working towards and achieving. So that's a very clear example of how we're all looking to move towards this from a very integrative approach. That being said, of course, there's complications, and I think this is where the white governance and the institutional part of this is so important, because we all know how at the end of the day government's policy operates, and it's very much driven by separated mandates, separated budgets, separated need for showing results. So that everything we can do to bring that together is fundamental. For example, one example of something we've been doing in the region very much, and in the past couple of decades have gained a lot of acceptance, is a multidimensional poverty index. So, usually at the country level, poverty is measured in terms of income, right? Everybody below a certain level, a certain poverty line is poor and or not. When you bring a multidimensional perspective to this, you see much more the richness of what needs to be done to really address that poverty. How can you really eradicate that poverty? So, different tools to look at these issues from an interdisciplinary perspective.
Yeah, I'm in awe of the work that you do, being able to take all the statistics and transform it into policy is so amazing. So thank you. I'd like to move on now and ask for Dr. Bell and Dr. Kane to weigh in next. My general line of questioning here has to do with what we're experiencing here in the U.S. As far as a dramatic reduction and pulling of federal funding for science. And I'm sure that has an impact, especially on women and girls. And Dr. Bell, I loved how you talked about seeing great strides be made from when women weren't even allowed to be in the field to now the great discoveries that you yourself made in Antarctica, as far as the rivers going uphill. But I wonder now if we're in jeopardy because of this lack of federal funding and what we do about this. Thank you so much. I think it just slowly comes on.
Okay. I think we got it. Yay! Oh, what do we do? I am worried. I am worried about this country in particular losing talent and driving people away, not just women, but people of all sorts. I am seeing more people, women in particular, look for jobs overseas, across the border, including some of the most prominent leaders in my space. So it is worrisome. Now I've said the worry. Okay. So what's the opportunity here? I guess the opportunity here is how can we think about what we've done that has made it, or how can we rethink how we open those doors and get people to the table? Because something we've been doing has been making it so people feel like they've been left behind. Mm-hmm. And I worry that we've been doing blame. It's something that when I first worked in diversity, we didn't do any of. We were very careful not to blame anybody. It didn't matter how much of a jerk you were. Let's just show you the data. Science is better with more people at the table. We won't say that you drove them all the way and told them they couldn't work here. But And I think we got to a point where we were doing much more blame. And I think we have to move back to where we're saying this, and it almost resonates with what you're working on, is this is the science environment we want, not this is how it's wrong and what you've done wrong. But we need to figure out what the key aspects are that is going to make it so people want to come here to the US, be scientists, and thrive with their families doing science. So I think that's the challenge for now, is to move past the, oh my God, things are terrible, to what do we imagine the science enterprise of the future to be, where women and girls and everybody else will thrive, but particularly the door will be open for women and girls.
Sure. You know, it's hard to follow that up. I feel in many ways you're my elder in academia, right? You've been doing this for a while, and I'm, you know, on the other side of things, pre-tenure and just kind of starting out, and feeling a lot of that intimidation and fear and uncertainty, and also seeing it in my students. And it's, you know, I'm at the University of Wyoming. It's a very rural, very conservative place to work, and you can really sense the impact right now of there are students there who feel that their worlds are contracting, right? That their opportunities are shrinking, and there's so much interest and desire and hunger to expand outwards. And so it feels like a generational thing. You know, this generation wants things to change, my students, and I have a lot of faith and hope in that. But it's also a shame that we aren't able at this moment to support them in pursuing the research that they are ready to undertake, you know. So I'm glad to hear some hope, some
I mean,
some
I'd like
advice.
to ask, like, are you seeing an increase in strategic planning? Like, okay, we're not going to get this federal funding. How about the nonprofit scene? What about private donation? I know there are some barriers to that in the university space, but are you seeing any kind of activity like that, maybe out of necessity, that perhaps turns into something better? Or not better, but, you know, so we don't drop.
Yeah, I certainly think there are private foundations stepping up to the plate. I know in anthropology, Wenner-Gren is just getting a giant wave of applications this year, but really stepping up to the plate and trying to help, especially younger scholars at this critical moment in their career. A lot of the organizations, you know, American Anthropological Association, I'm sure, and other fields as well, are stepping up to support young scholars. And so I think, you know, we're doing the best we can, but with limited resources.
And I'll add to that, I think that not-for-profits and individuals are stepping up, which is good. But I honor the process of the peer review that's at the federal government, that is where I felt I could thrive on an equitable playing field, which is really hard to find. I mean, some of the foundations are trying very hard in that space, but I think we need to ensure that we support federal funding for science, unless we're willing to rethink the scientific enterprise entirely, because of the safeguards and the processes that are in place there. That means that, okay, here's my tiny little bit of hope. Last week, I had a friend who's a bulldog. It's a she. But she had a mission to measure the elevation of the ice sheet that was really close to being, you know, in the last competition at NASA. And then the election in the US happened. And she flipped her team so hard to better demonstrating why that data set will benefit us all, as opposed to just making nice, shiny images for me to show, that she got funded last week. Yes. So one of the lessons here is that we as scientists have to make sure that we are explaining, that's why I told you the dumb phone story, why our science matters. Because I think it's not really clear that rivers running uphill will immediately impact you. Or people didn't think Murray finding that mountain range would impact them. But it builds our understanding of how things work, where we find the resources we need to live. And we need to make sure we justify our science to the communities that are supporting us.
Well said. Yes. Science is exhausting. I'm getting ready to take questions from the audience. I just have one more question I absolutely need to ask our panelists. And it's a tough one once again. The US has witnessed an increase in federal policies that promote fossil fuel production, and we've seen a near eradication of not just the language of climate change in the US, but also the regulations being weakened. And I wonder if either of you are concerned about this or have any strategies that you've talked amongst colleagues for, again, how to deal with this or how to make sure it doesn't happen again.
I think how many synonyms for climate change can we come up with in our research?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear it from an academic perspective, if possible, what you're doing, or what you're thinking. You're the smart ones.
Oh, I mean, it's it's frustrating. But I think the more that we work on just communicating across difference, communicating the data, providing empirical evidence, and just speaking to the importance of what we do and what we're finding and how it's impacting people throughout the globe as often as we can and to as many people as will let us. In the classroom, in our casual conversations, those ripple effects I think matter. Even if right now, we truly are just trying to find new ways to say climate change that won't get flagged by AI or something like that. And just keep having these conversations.
Yeah.
It's really bad. I won't say that. It's, losing that endangerment finding at EPA is worrisome.
Yes.
What I hope is that this does two things. One, encourage the experts like us to speak simpler and clearer to people. I knew there's a word I was looking for. And people beyond our spheres. And also to consider, and my husband is deeply committed to live sustainably and have fun. So it meant that we were some of the first people to have electric motorcycles. We've moved past because, as he said, we've lived our death-free miles, and we should stop riding electric motorcycles before we die from a motorcycle accident. And it comes back to your resilient comment, because it's not, I'm going to drown you because I study ice sheets, and it's going to be awful. But it's instead, I study ice sheets, I'm concerned, and I am riding this awfully cool machine that probably accelerates better than your Harley because I care about our planet. Would you like to talk about my acceleration? So it's, again, talking about our shared future. And this probably comes from me having told too many times people I'm going to drown, showing pictures of how I'm going to drown Florida, depending on which ice sheet I melt, and realizing I'm just scaring people.
Yeah.
And fear isn't a way to build partnerships and moving forward. So your concept of, I'm not going to get it right, institutions.
Instruments and infrastructure.
I know, I knew I got one of them. But that approach of how we look to be resilient together based on the science, but not with fear and anger.
Can AI help?
Oh, sure.
I don't know, lazy one, but it's easy.
Maybe AI or LLMs might help us here?
I think they could, but just to add it, and not from a U.S. perspective or funding perspective, but perhaps broader. I think the trend you described is not unique to the U.S. I think we're seeing it in many countries across the world. We're seeing it in countries in the region, and I think, and you know, of course, it's a challenge. And I think it's a challenge, particularly for very specific scientific academic research. But from more a policy perspective, which is the space that we where we are, the space that we fill, I think, the governance aspect of development is very important. The priorities that are set in different countries by different agendas, the governments that are elected, reflect in a way who's sitting at the table where decisions are made. So I think the work on improving governance, on opening spaces for dialogue, on finding those areas where we can converge, regardless of political ideology, and kind of building up from there. I think is a space where we can still try to find spaces for improvement in challenging times. And like I mentioned in the region, and our data in the report shows, the world is much more polarized than 10 years ago, much more polarized than 20 years ago. It's a trend across the board. Latin America and the Caribbean in particular is the most polarized region in the world.
Wow.
What that means is basically that societies are dividing into groups where they share common characteristics and feeling farther and farther away from other groups where they deem them as different. What that means is less spaces for conversation, for dialogue, less ability to form coalitions, to take actions, and governments that are elected with very little margins, very little majorities, where parts of the population feel like they're not being represented by the governments they elect. So I think, just to put on the table, I think that the conversation around governance, institutions, the state, the capacity of the state to deliver results is very important as well. And you mentioned AI. I went a completely different route.
And then questions from the audience.
I think, we look at AI a lot in our work, and I think AI opens a lot of opportunities, for research, mapping, looking at trends, looking at different things. And there's beautiful examples in the region of AI being used to track different weather patterns and track different populations of different biodiversity. And I think it's a tool that we can all find the creative ways. I think it's also, we need to look at AI with caution, right? AI is very energy intensive, very water intensive. We're seeing, for example, in our regions, Latin America and the Caribbean right now is a region that has a very small part of data centers compared to the rest of the world. To really use AI, you need the capacity, you need the data centers. Right now, only like about 4.8% of data centers, global data centers, are located in the region. Most of them are private owned. So in countries that are looking to build data centers, we see a lot of social unrest around it because there's priorities around water use and energy use. So I think also looking at AI for solutions, by all means, I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but we also need to understand how we expand AI and how we use it, and what are those efficient uses of AI. Because at this moment, and hopefully the technology advances, it is very energy and water intensive.
100%. Let's hear from the audience. I think someone has a microphone.
So I have a question. You showed data about days of temperature exposure, and it looked like in Latin America, the Caribbean was much more affected, that people who lived in the Caribbean were exposed to more dangerous temperatures than anywhere else in Latin America. What kind of policies can be made to address this, especially when those people who are making policies might not feel very connected to these populations or this part of the world?
Absolutely, yes. So what you observe is absolutely true. What we see is the Caribbean tends to have, per day, per person, more days of dangerous heat, and it's growing faster. And I think the Caribbean and SIDS, small island development states, developing states in general, tend to be at the forefront of feeling the effects of climate change across the board. More heat, rising sea levels, more extreme weather events with more intensity. And it's also a population, like you say, that they represent a small portion of the global population. However, they represent a large number of countries in terms of the global number of countries. So I think, in the Caribbean has been really good about this, about coming together as a region, as a sub-region, and coming to the table in these multilateral spaces as one voice. So the Caribbean has been really strong in having these Caribbean integration institutions. They have CARICOM, they have a number of institutions, and they come to negotiations at the UN and other instances as a group, as a bloc, and that matters. And I think they're together with other small island developing states in Asia and other parts of the world, there is a very strong agenda for supporting SIDS, because the reality is they are not causing any of the climate change, right? They're not, for the most part, industrialized countries. They're not. It's not about them having carbon emissions, but they are feeling the effects, and that's why in the past COP around climate change, they're talking about loss and damages and how to implement that work around loss and damages. So that's a conversation that is ongoing. But I think at this point, the focus in countries like that is mitigation and adaptation, right? So how can populations, economies, infrastructure, institutions adapt and mitigate these impacts, knowing that, Caribbean populations are likely not going to stop the melting of glaciers or the ice cap, right? So I think that's an agenda that is really important right now.
Thank you so much. Those numbers were shocking. Next.
Hi, my name is Contessa Bourbon. I'm a journalist. I'd like to ask Dr. Bell, what challenges you face as a young scientist or as a girl scientist, and how did you overcome it, and what is your advice to recruit or to encourage more young girls to be to work or to study science or STEM? Thank you.
Let's see, where to start. Science has changed. It was not very welcoming. The day I got to graduate school, the person in my office says, "I don't think my advisor was expecting a new student. You must be mistaken." That's day one. But what I found was two things. One, build a network. So one of my strategies has been to realize that the other women are not competitors, but they're actually my support system. So the woman who I lived in Chile with and flew over Antarctica with is still one of my dearest friends, and she has a satellite on its way to Europa. So we've stayed together and stayed connected. So one is build a network. Another is when you get angry and you want to change things, sometimes you can't change the one you want to right away, but just wait. And then there'll be that moment in time where you can change that. So sometimes I offer patience as when you're angry about your students want to change everything. I sometimes offer patience as the appropriate tool, because there will be a moment you can change things. In our field, I watched my fellow students get harassed and bullied and their careers significantly impacted. And I couldn't do anything about it, not even when I had $5 million from NSF. But because academics are fairly conservative, but as up to my professional organization, we were able to define bullying and harassment as scientific misconduct. So if you have a record of bullying and harassing, you cannot get awards and you cannot be a leader. So it's, you know, patience, looking for those moments where you really can make a difference, and still remembering that there's this wonder and awe in science that you can see. She sees about economics and policy, and she sees about anthropology, is that we're, and the women you work with in Peru understand with their way of seeing the planet, is that we live in a space where that's honored, and understanding how things work is a privilege and a wonderful thing to do. And yes, my daughter is working in physics.
Yay. Next question.
I have a question for Almeida. Is it Almeida? So as I think about human development and the metrics that go with that versus policies from government officials, which is GDP, innovation, you can get, I think, growth in GDP, innovation, data centers, whatever, and not even have to deal with human development. That 56% that you showed in Latin America, those people, GDP will grow, everything will happen without their human development. So in terms of policy, the metrics also have to change. And as I think about the polarization that you talk about in Latin America, polarization all over, but there are certain countries that may have the right mindset for human development. Why not work with those? You don't have to have the whole sector and to get that moving. So I'm just going to push back on Dr. Bell. I'm not a patient person. If you're patient, let's just wait. It's not going to happen. So what's giving that thought? How can you move forward? I'm a Columbia alum as well. So you're Columbia, right? Yes. Yeah. So I'm going to push it back and say, how can, and also Dr. Kane, if you have some ideas, because the certain, the women in Peru, is it Peru? Yeah, they're 300 folks. No one cares about those 300 women. No one cares about the 56%. But how can we form a coalition so that they're larger, become larger numbers and have greater voice in getting part of that policy change?
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think that's a brilliant thoughts and questions. And a couple of things. I think it's very important to note that economic growth and human development are related. So I think it's important to also recognize that when there's a lot of economic growth, poverty tends to start declining. However, the type of growth matters, right? There's growth that reduces poverty at a faster rate and a more sustainable rate. Also, what we saw in Latin America in the era of the commodity booms in the early 2000s is that, poverty was at 50% at that point. So we grew and that poverty was reduced. But it's very different to reduce poverty when you're at 50% and you reduce it to 25% than reducing poverty when you're at 25 and trying to reach that last 25%, right? So there's a little bit of a low-hanging fruit. And what we see is that poverty that is more entrenched, that is more chronic, that is perhaps those communities that are farther away, where deprivations overlap, right? It's not just income. That reducing that poverty, which is where we're getting at in Latin America, is much harder. And it has to be much more than growth. It has to be growth that generates jobs. It has to be growth that is inclusive. And then you need policies that are able to redistribute part of that progress to certain groups. And I think that's where we're seeing, that's why we're seeing this slowdown of progress in the region. Taken that the region is not growing at the rate that it was growing a decade at the beginning of the 2000s. Now Latin America and the Caribbean is a region that grows very slowly. But also because the policies that we used back then are no longer being effective. We're not reaching those populations. So I think understanding poverty from a multidimensional perspective. So that's what human development concept is, right? It's looking at human development, where we want to go, as really having the freedom to live the lives you want to be. And that means not having deprivations in certain areas that are relevant to be able to allow you to live that life. Deprivations, of course, around income, but also deprivations around knowledge, around health, around agency, right? Having the capacity to vote, to elect who's going to represent you, to influence those decisions. And that's why we are looking at many different metrics, and you mentioned metrics. Our Human Development Index, which is the first graph I showed you, that was published in 1990 in our first Human Development Report. And at the time, it was groundbreaking because it combined, as a measure of progress, income, education, and health. That's it. The Human Development Index only combines those three measures. And at the time, it was critiqued as nonsense. People said, this makes no sense. It all depends on income. If you have income, you can have education. If you have income, you can have health. But that's not true. In certain places, there's no markets. No matter how much money you have, there's nowhere. In certain places, there's discriminations that don't allow girls and women to get the type of educations or have the type of careers. And this we see very often, right? For example, and go back to the topic of today, we see, for example, Latin America is now a region that more girls graduate from high school than boys. However, when we look, for example, how many pursue careers in STEM, we see that it's only 4 out of 10. So, from being more than 50%, now we're looking at 40%. And then when we see how many get jobs in STEM, that percentage declines significantly. So what is happening at those steps of the way? There's barriers, there's social norms, there's discrimination, there's care responsibilities, right? That consistently make it harder for women and girls. So it's not an income problem in that sense, right? It's a problem of really being able to expand options. So when we think of human development from that, then you can see how the policy has to be jobs, but it's also about care systems, right? It's also about access to financial assets and financial inclusion. It is also about governance, women being able to be part of the tables where decisions are made. For example, in Latin America and the Caribbean, we saw a big increase in female representation at the parliamentary level, at the government level. However, in the past few years, we've seen a backlash where these numbers are being lower. And when we look at reasons why, we see that women, for example, have a lot more violence against them through social media and through new technologies. And, a lot of women are deciding not to enter politics because the violence is so strong, and it not only impacts them, but their families as well. So that's why we really have to look at development from a fundamental level. But in terms of metrics, we have the Human Development Index. We also do this multidimensional poverty index, which we work with governments one-on-one. So they decide what are those dimensions they want to include. So that's kind of setting a social agenda, right? So if you include, and usually what you include is issues around health, issues around education, issues around the quality of a house, of the place you're dwelling, the place where you live. Some countries decide to include citizen security because there's a lot of places where citizen security is impacting the people's capacity to do things, from going to school to going to work. Some countries include issues around digitalization and access to digital. So this is something that is part of the agenda, and metrics are very important. And I think you mentioned why not pick a few countries where governments are more aligned. I think you can always find, in any government we work with, and UNDP is present in 175 countries. We're present in
33 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. So we're everywhere, and governments change and we stay, right? So you can always find an agenda item where we can continue to work towards. We're partners to governments, so we work towards their development objectives, but bringing these perspectives into the table.
Thank you. Yes.
A couple of questions for Dr. Bell on Antarctica. Here.
Okay.
Why do the rivers flow upward? And the second, why is that spot on the lower left corner of the continent much more depleted of ice than everywhere else?
Okay. The rivers first. Normally, we think of rivers like if this was the mountain and this is the river valley, it would run downhill, right? Because gravity pulls it. But now I'm going to have to figure out how to do this and hold the mic. Can you hold the mic? Yeah. I don't know if we can do.
It's the podium.
The podium. Okay. So I can wave my arm. So normally water runs down the hill like that. But if you put an ice sheet on top of it, the pressure down here between my elbows, there's more ice. And you're squeezing the water up the hill. It's like you went out in the backyard and you had a hose and you jumped on it at the bottom. You could squirt water out. And the ice sheet is asking like you jumping on the water in the hose.
Amazing.
And the other question.
So that's how you want to.
The other question was, why is the melting so
Right.
concentrated?
Right. So Antarctica is actually, if we were to take off all the ice, you'll see that there are two parts of Antarctica. There's the part where the mountains are. That's above sea level and kind of looks like Canada, old, high continent. And then the part you see was changing is actually a shallow sea. And so that ice is sitting in the ocean, actually. So it's much more susceptible to warming ocean water because the warming ocean water can get up to its edges and then it retreats. So that's the peninsula where all the people who go on tour ships go that points up towards South America. That's changing a lot. But the part that's the large part that's changing is because it's close to the warm ocean and it is sitting where it's susceptible.
Got it. I have so many more questions. However, I'm afraid we have run up against our time limit. So why don't you all join me in thanking our panelists? I think that, yes.
Now we are delighted to offer you a Spanish wine in our gallery where you can visit our wonderful exhibition. Thank you. Thank you for this amazing event.